And hello, church history friends. My name is Barb Walden, and I am happy to be the one to welcome you to tonight's program. Thank you for joining us as we welcome Seth Bryant as our second guest historian in the autumn 2025 lecture series. Well, joining me tonight is the one and only Wendy Eaton. Wendy serves as the administrative assistant here at the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation. She is doing the work of two people tonight as Peter Smith is taking the night off. So welcome, Wendy, and thank you for all you do and helping out behind the scenes. It's really good to have you here. Now, tonight is the second lecture in another series of fascinating church history lectures. Together this season, we will learn about politics in 1830s Kirtland, the Whitmer family's influence on the early years of the church, the formation of the church in Nigeria in the 1960s, and Cecil Edinger's role in those early years. And we will add one more storyteller in our Your Story is Church History series as we welcome Andrew Bolton to share his unique journey with us. You can register for any of these lectures by heading over to the Foundation's website. Wendy has already dropped the link into the chat. Now, there are two lectures that are shaping things up for us or shaking things up for us from our usual Thursday night tradition. Next Thursday's program will begin 6 hours early to accommodate our friends overseas. Andrew, our guest speaker, will join us virtually from Leicester, England. And considering Andrew is doing us a real favor by sharing his journey with us, we're not going to ask him to share his story an hour past midnight his time. Instead, he'll be sharing at 7 p.m. London time, making it 1 p.m. Central USA our time. So we hope you will join us for that program on November 20th, next Thursday. The second program I want to highlight is Mark Staker's lecture on Tuesday, December 2nd. That's right, we have two lectures in 1 week. Mark Staker will present on Giving Tuesday, a night where our board will be matching any donations given in support of Community of Christ history, while 2 days later, we will welcome David Edinger as our final guest speaker in the fall lecture series. David, I think, is one of the great storytellers in Community of Christ, so you definitely don't want to miss his lecture. That week is going to be a double dose of church history. It's also our final week of the series. Now, of course, if Andrew Bolton and Mark Staker's programs don't match your schedules this year, not to worry, you can always catch the recording available on our website and our YouTube channel. So friends, there is really no way we could host lectures like tonight's program without your generous support. Your gifts for the fall lecture series go to developing new educational programs. They help fund the Alma Blair internship program. They support the expansion of oral histories. They help sponsor our annual church history bus tour and ensure that we can continue providing online programs like our lecture series and book series long into the future. You can see the QR code on the screen, and Wendy will drop the online donation link and mailing address into the chat. Thank you for considering supporting our organization. We sure appreciate you, friends. We are excited to have Seth Bryant with us this evening. He's here to share his research on 1830s Kirtland, and I couldn't be more thrilled. He's a familiar face here, as he's often found serving as a co-host for our online lectures. For those of you who don't know Seth, I'll share a brief introduction. Seth lives here in Kirtland, Ohio, and serves as the Historic Sites Property Manager for Community of Christ. He's a former site director of the Kirtland Temple and also served as pastor of the Salt Lake City Community of Christ congregation. Before that, Seth was a chaplain for the Marine Corps Infantry Battalion in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, and 29 Palms, California. He holds graduate degrees in religion, focusing on American religious history. Welcome, Seth. It's always good to see you. I'll turn the spotlight over to you because we're ready to learn about 1830s Kirtland politics and some peculiar people.
Well, I'm very excited to be here to see so many friends in the chat and to spend some time talking about Kirtland history, church history. I always love to share church history. And we're going to dive into something that um, I'll be honest, I didn't know a ton about until I started my research, and that was on politics in 1830s Kirtland. So I was on a tour one time, and I asked if there were any questions, and someone said, "Well, how did politics play into the Saints' experience?" And I didn't have a good answer. And so that was, what, 6 years ago, maybe, or more. And I've always said I'm going to do some research. And so here it is. And I actually gave this presentation at John Whitmer a couple months ago, but this is quite a bit updated. I did further research and challenged some of my conclusions from that original paper. So if you were at that John Whitmer session, there's some new stuff in here. So here's our roadmap for tonight. I'm going to talk about township style government, talk about the right to vote, and then we're going to look at Frederick G. Williams, who was a counselor in the first presidency. We're also going to look at the Northern Times, which was a church newspaper produced here in Kirtland in the 1830s, and then I've got some conclusions. All right, so when they were allowed to vote, Latter-day Saint males in 1830s Kirtland often voted differently than their neighbors. Frictions in local politics, including disenfranchisement of the saints and their differing political views, are one important way of understanding 1830s Latter-day Saint history. Now, as one might expect, these political conflicts didn't just impact the relationships that the saints had with their neighbors, but it caused tension within the church itself when Mormon leaders who served as elected officials had to choose which master they would serve. So, as I said, we're going to look at history of townships and voting, then Kirtland politics in the 1830s, and how it impacted those relationships. So let's start with the township. The township style of government had roots going back 1,000 years or more in England, which surprised me. So townships are a division of a parish that had civil functions, including taking care of roads as well as caring for the poor. This style of government was imported to North America from England with the Pilgrims in 1620 and with later immigrants. In New England, township governance involved direct democracy with residents participating in open meetings. The day-to-day operations of the town fell to a board of selectmen, especially in larger towns. Now, this slide here that you see from Massachusetts in 1634, it's what we're seeing here is that in order to take part in the governance process, newcomers to a New England township had to be approved either by the other residents or by the town representatives, the selectmen. As Kenneth Winkle observes, this careful personal sifting process of newcomers was designed to protect both the social homogeneity of the community and the financial resources of the town government. Inasmuch as care for the poor fell on the township, new arrivals had to demonstrate financial stability or else they were warned out of town. So here's a good example just from one township, but there were laws like this across New England of warning people out of town if they didn't either weren't financially stable or didn't fit the mold of what the established residents wanted to see. Often land ownership was used as a standard for financial stability and overall fitness, but also good character, service to the community, and length of habitancy could and would be considered. So this township style of government was mandated by law in Northeast Ohio and elsewhere on the frontier by Congress's 1785 Ordinance for Lands in the Western Territory. So here's the first page of the ordinance, and then this I pulled out from the ending here instructions to surveyors on how they were to lay out the territory into townships by lines running due north and south and crossing at right angles. So here in Northeast Ohio, this was once actually the Western Reserve of Connecticut. It's the reserve portion of land that was deeded to the colony of Connecticut in its original charter from the Crown. The Connecticut charter from the King proclaimed that the territory shall extend from the Western Ocean to the South Seas. So what we call today the Pacific had been named the South Sea by Vasco Nunez del Balboa in 1513. And the Western Ocean, you can probably guess, referred to the Atlantic. See, the English had this habit of labeling everything in relation to themselves with themselves as the center place. Sounds familiar. So the colony of Connecticut, in theory, and you can see this arrow here, extended from that Atlantic beach line all the way to the Pacific on the authority of the king without consent of the actual people who occupied those lands. After the Revolutionary War, the original colonies relinquished claims to their western territories, and they did this in exchange for the federal government assuming their debt, thereby creating the Northwest Territory. Connecticut, however, retained some of their land. They did so because they had suffered such great losses during the Revolutionary War. So they retained a portion, and that became known as the Western Reserve. It's this reserve portion along Lake Erie, west of Connecticut, obviously. And they set aside this western portion for those who had suffered property losses during the Revolutionary War. I should say the far western portion of the Western Reserve was set aside for those who had suffered losses. They called it the Fire Lands or the Sufferers' Lands. And then the eastern portion of the reserve, where I live in Kirtland, was sold to land speculators in 1795. Now these speculators were known as the Connecticut Land Company, and they surveyed the Western Reserve beginning a year later in 1796, led by General Moses Cleveland. They divided the region into townships measuring 5 miles square. Kirtland was named after Turhan Kirtland. He's one of the members of Cleveland's survey crew. So about 6 years later, the first settlers arrived in Kirtland, as early as 1803, the same year Ohio became a state. None of those original settlers in Kirtland stayed, however, because the nearby townships were much more desirable for farming. Kirtland, however, is filled with hills and ravines and just makes it difficult to farm. So the other areas around Kirtland, you see them settled around the time settlers get here in Kirtland, but Kirtland itself doesn't get any established residents for about a decade later. So what was Kirtland like back in 1805? Well, we have the record of an early missionary in the reserve. His name was Thomas Robbins. He notes in his journal on 25 June of 1805 that he left Cleveland and, quote, rode to Kirtland, had pretty hard lodging, but people kind, end quote. In 1811, Christopher Crary arrived as a child. I should say Christopher G. Crary. Sometimes his father is mentioned as well in the history. So the son arrived as a child to Kirtland with his family. His father was a Revolutionary War Marine, actually. And it's the Crary family that become the first permanent residents here and actually live on where their farm was. So Christopher G. Crary documents just how rough life was in Kirtland at that time, with stories of cannons booming from British warships on Lake Erie. He speaks of Indians and wolves and rattlesnakes and bears and wildcats. After the War of 1812, that's when you see settlement of Kirtland begin in earnest, and some of the new arrivals being former neighbors in Derby, Connecticut. Kirtland Township was officially organized in 1817 with the election of officers and beginning of a government record. And it's from this record that I pull a lot of my research for tonight. The township structure of government in Kirtland included town trustees. So they're using trustees in Ohio instead of selectmen, but it's the same basic idea. They also had overseers of the poor, clerks of election, constables, and other officers. Isaac Morley was one of the first trustees of Kirtland, along with Christopher Crary Sr. and Laurie Holmes. Peter French and Isaac Moore were the overseers of the poor. And remember, that's one of the, going back 1,000 years or more, that's one of the functions of the township, to care for the poor or kick people out to avoid them being a drain on local resources. In 1829, so this is a year before the Saints arrive, Newell K. Whitney appears in this government record, being elected as township treasurer and then later as a fence viewer. In September of 1830, there was an election held in Kirtland for justices of the peace, and all the qualified electors were listed out. I wish they did this every year. They don't. It would be so useful if they had, but this is one of the few times they list out the electors. So besides saints who had established Kirtland residency before converting, like Reynolds Cahoon and F.G. Williams and Newell K. Whitney, the newly arrived Latter-day Saints were generally excluded in the list of 67 electors. A month later, in October of 1830, they have another election. This time 113 electors were listed, a 69% increase from the election only a few weeks before. Again, we see Reynolds Cahoon, F.G. Williams, and Newell K. Whitney included in that list of electors, but no newly arrived followers of Joseph Smith, and I should say male followers of Joseph Smith, had been added to that list. Now, a couple questions rise from this. The first, why was there a dramatic increase in voter participation in October of 1830? While it's true that the township was riled up, I should say, over the arrival of Joseph Smith Jr. and his followers, it was later that year. So that can't be it. There's another issue that seems to be driving the increase in voter participation. Now, from the beginning of the township in 1818 until 1830, the number of electors is predictable based on population growth in the township overall. So keep in mind that they don't always give us the data that I want to find, right? And population is very difficult. I have to pull it from other sources. But from extrapolating where there was missing data, what I found is that about 5.4% of the total township population are in that electorate, meaning that you have 5% who actually get to vote. Or if we don't look at the average, we look at the mean, it's 6.7%, which is a more accurate picture, I think, because it excludes some outliers, both high turnout elections and some low turnout elections. So about 5 to 6, maybe 7% are participating in the elections. October election, so if we go back 2 years in 1828, that's one of the outliers, as well as this October 1830. Electors making up 15.8% and then 10.5% of the population, respectively. And the reason for this is that there was a vote being taken as to whether or not they should sell their state lands that funded public education. So as many of you know, certain lands are often set aside in a public trust, and money taken from renting or leasing those lands go to support public education. So apparently it had them quite riled up. Um, if we look at that, it's not the Saints. In fact, it's too early for the Saints. They're showing up at the polls. What we have is an active township where people are taking part and are getting riled up over things and responding to it. So in 1828, they shoot down the measure to sell the public lands. In 1830, they actually pass it. What's interesting, though, is we look at this involvement in township politics, we see that Latter-day Saint males are not added to that list of electors a year in, 2 years in, and in actuality, we shouldn't be too concerned about that because, as I'll go into deeper, if you're a new arrival in the township, you've got to have residency to vote in a town meeting. So exclusion isn't necessarily troubling. But after 2 years after you have Saints arriving in Kirtland, you see that they are being denied access to the polls, as would have been the case under normal circumstances. The township actually goes so far to make their disapproval official by warning out Smith and several other leading members starting in 1831. So if you'll recall back to this township from Massachusetts, that if there's a foreigner come amongst us in our meetings, unless he'll subject himself unto the orders and penalties that we have established, he's not welcome. And what's interesting is that in Kirtland, that's being used. The leading church members, males specifically, and their families are being warned out of town, not because they don't have enough money, but to disenfranchise them so that they're not able to vote or appear on the ballot. And those warnings out start as early as 1831 and as late as 1834. So right after they arrive in 1831, as late as 1834, we see the township actually denying access to Joseph Smith Jr. and other key church leaders. But there's a shift that occurs in 1834 where the saints begin making enough inroads to challenge those warning outs, and they actually begin to appear on the ballot. So what's interesting to me is that around 1834, the number of saints in Kirtland became about 1 to 1 to the original residents. So if we look here at Kirtland, this Kirtland demographics here, you'll see in 18, so we have 1820 is the first one. Obviously, there's no Latter-day Saints here in 1820. 1830, we have, by the end, really into 1831, we start to have a small number of Latter-day Saints, about 1,000 residents and about 55 saints into 1831. But when we jump to 1837, we have 1,200 residents and 2,000 saints that are here, with about 241 electors taking place. And then, of course, uh, so the temple's dedicated in 1836, 1837 into 38, we have the saints leaving, so that by 1839, there's about 100 Latter-day Saints left in Kirtland, and the township population is at about 1,600. So this chart here, I'm really comfortable with the numbers here. I am not, this is where I had to extrapolate. So all of the elections from 1818 to 1840 are represented here. The number of electors are in red. They're those tiny little squares. The members, or I should say people in Kirtland who are not Latter-day Saints, are the yellow bar. So in 1820, we have just shy of 500. By 1830, we have about 1,000. And then, as I mentioned before, 1839, we have about 1,500. And this dotted line is just a linear progression um, that I've placed. Now, if you look here at 1830, really should be a little after this, but this is when the first Latter-day Saints start to show up, and then we have this massive population increase that leads to uh, eventually all of them leaving by 1838. And that drop, that dotted line drop, is not precipitous enough to show just how many saints had left. But they say that the wagon train went on for a mile out of Kirtland. There were so many saints that were leaving. What I find interesting is this intersection between the yellow dotted line and the green dotted line about 1834. And again, this is an extrapolation, but it's at about this moment here that you see Latter-day Saints taking place in elections and being elected to office. I'll also note that there's a drop in non-Latter-day Saint Kirtland residents in 1837. And that's backed up with my research of the Congregationalist and Presbyterian church in town, which today is known as Old South. In their records, they show people were leaving Kirtland as you have an influx of Latter-day Saints. And then it appears, so if we look at the number of electors in 1840, you have quite a jump in electors in the late 1830s, but it doesn't drop when the Saints leave, which is interesting to me. And it seems to imply to me that the elite who were taking part, or maybe just the motivated, you had to be elite, but you also had to be motivated, that there weren't necessarily a large number of Latter-day Saints that were taking part at the polls, or we would see a larger increase in the number of electors here. All right, so the second part of my presentation is on the right to vote. The right to vote in the United States was once severely limited compared to what we enjoy today. So we can't take our what we know of voting today and map it onto the 1830s. most importantly, because people at the polls, you had to be a land-holding white male, age 21 or older. For women, suffrage equality came with the 19th Amendment, so this is in 1920. It had been preceded by the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 15th Amendment of 1870, allowing men of African descent to vote, which is bolstered, of course, by the Civil Rights Act of 1965. So while we might take it for granted today, there was a time when just moving from one state to another could call your voting rights into question, assuming again that you were a white, landowning, adult male. Even moving from township to township within the same state placed your residency and therefore voting rights in limbo. Again, to quote from Kenneth Winkle, he's got a great book called The Politics of Community, Migration and Politics in Antebellum Ohio. He writes, Ohio discriminated against recent immigrants by imposing lengthy residence requirements, often a year or more, for the exercise of some basic rights. Further, Ohio's Constitution and early laws amplified this discrimination against recent migrants by delegating authority over two basic rights, suffrage and poor relief, to its local administrative units, the townships. So Winkle's to add to Winkle's commentary on voting rights in the 19th century, you need to add this additional opposition faced by the Saints for their religious and political views not matching those of the long-time residents. So this discrimination took advantage of the fact that you have to have residency to vote. Should you have residency and you're an adult white male, then you have all the rights of suffrage. Residency in a township, regardless of age or gender, also provided the benefits of poverty relief. So for this reason, local officials were hesitant to give up residency to impoverished newcomers because the burden of caring for them would fall upon the township. Down to within the record, you see cases of people who were declared to be impoverished, and then the local residents being called upon, taxed basically, to take care of them. And it could be in the form of, hey, we bought this amount of food for them, and now you need to pay for it. So residency, poverty relief, and suffrage were all connected issues. To become a settled resident, to gain the right to vote, and to have that protection against poverty, a newcomer had to meet those criteria established in an 1805 Ohio law, such as owning land or taking part in public service. If you weren't a good fit, you could be warned out of town, regardless of your financial situation. After receiving a warning to depart, Winkle writes that, quote, migrants could remain in the township but not as legal residents. So it didn't kick you out. You could remain. You just weren't a resident with the benefits of residency. So several Latter-day Saint migrants to Kirtland fell in this category, including, as I mentioned before, Joseph Smith Jr., having been warned out of town not due to poverty, but a lack of civic fitness, according to the established residents. Now, even if a person gained residency, American townships had one last firewall if they didn't like you. Voting was consensual following the New England model, meaning that on election day, today we have ballot boxes where you have privacy. Not back then. Each ballot was cast. It only became validated by the election judge through consensus of the other settled residents of the township. So if they didn't approve of you, your ballot could and likely would be rejected in that meeting. Disenfranchisement against perceived outsiders was experienced in other Northeast Ohio townships during the period, not just Kirtland. So the Observer and Telegraph, a paper in Hudson, Ohio, reported that a man was warned out of town because he belonged to the Temperance Society. So I love this, The Drunkard's Progress, and well, maybe I don't love the ending, but it just shows just how opposed, right, people could be to alcohol. But they're in Hudson, Ohio, apparently the people didn't like the Temperance Society, and so they kicked this man off the rolls by the voting rolls by warning him out of town. So Eber D. Howe, in his autobiography, recounted that newly arrived saints in Kirtland boasted of soon taking over politics in the area. He wrote that as their numbers constantly increased, the saints made boasts that in a short time they would control all the county offices and elect a number of Congress from their own ranks. In view of all their gaseous pretensions, the surrounding country was becoming somewhat sensitive, and many of our citizens thought it advisable to take all the legal means within their reach to counteract the progress of so dangerous an enemy in their midst, and many lawsuits ensued. So we have lawsuits as another way that the local established residents are opposing these new arrivals, as well as warning them out. In any event, it's to try to disenfranchise the saints or harass them enough to keep them out of influence in public life. So that brings me to my third part, the case of Frederick G. Williams. Before converting to the Church of Christ, Frederick G. Williams was a respected physician in Kirtland who was financially well off. He had previously held local office when living in nearby Warrensville, Ohio, in Cuyahoga County, and had been elected and then re-elected as township clerk for 4 years. He was also active in county government, as seen by his several petitions to the county commissioners for the construction of a road. When he moved his family to Kirtland around 1829, they purchased 2 large lots, which were later deeded to the church, upon which the temple was built, although the title was clouded and Peter French also made a claim to what is Lot 30, where the temple was built. As mentioned previously, though he was a newcomer to Kirtland, as a respected landowner and doctor, and someone who held office in a nearby township, Williams took part in Kirtland Township elections almost immediately in 1830. His local influence, however, was degraded when he joined with Joseph Smith's movement, culminating in him being warned out by Kirtland Township overseers of the poor in 1831. Williams's disenfranchisement was almost certainly due to his political potential as an established resident and a former official who held an invaluable role in the township as a doctor. Eventually, his warning out would be overturned, Williams running for and winning election as Township Justice of the Peace in 1836. His biographer noting that this made him, in all probability, the first member of the church to be elected to public office. My research reveals that there were actually a few other saints voted to public office before him, beginning with John Johnson and his son Luke Johnson, who won office 2 years before in 1834. Now, John and Luke Johnson and Frederick G. Williams had some similarities. As leaders for both the township and the church, all three, interestingly, faced pressure in carrying out their duties to both, leading to temporary disaffiliation from the church for all three of them. So Williams had been the second pick for Joseph's second counselor in the first presidency, filling that role after Jesse Goss was excommunicated. Goss was a former Shaker and brought experience with communalism while the Saints were experimenting with the United Order. So he's bringing something to the table. And I think in different ways, Williams contributed by bringing his political experience and capital to the table. So for example, he drew the floor plans of the Temple and Independence, and he also drew the plat of Zion, and he drew the plat of Kirtland, which you're seeing a picture of here. And he's almost certainly drawing upon his previous government experience filing road plans with county officials as he's creating these plats and in his experience working with the Temple Committee. So the question remains, how do the Saints go from being shut out of local elections to having someone like Williams elected in 1836? It seems, now further research is needed, but it seems that a Mormon district emerged in North Kirtland. I don't think it was planned. I think that's how it worked out, with the original township power brokers congregating in the south part of the town. For example, during the height of Latter-day Saints' successes in 1836, elections were held in the southern part of the township, identifying the location, the record identifying the location as the Presbyterian Meeting House, Kirtland Center. Today we call that Old South. It's interesting that it's being called Kirtland Center at that time. While the record is often silent on where elections were held, this was the first recorded instance when it was noted to have taken place in a church versus a home or a school or other shared community space. The timing and choice of location at the other end of town from the temple might tell us something of community tensions. Then again, 2 months later, elections were held at the Methodist Meeting House next to the temple. So, and you can actually see, if you see these three buildings, they plan to build three temples. So the one at the top, right, that's the temple that was built today. The Methodist Meeting House would have been just across from that, about where it says 114 there. And then the next year, 1837, the elections were held down the hill in the flats at the Red Schoolhouse, just north of the temple. So, in all fairness, it's possible that elections were simply moving to different locations to accommodate citizens in all areas or districts of the township. Again, it seems to support, though, that there's a cognizance of community leaders of where people are at and trying to make things not just all held in one place, even though they're calling the Presbyterian Meeting House Old South, they're calling that Kirtland Center. They're still moving things around. So, inviting elite Latter-day Saint males like Frederick G. Williams into the circle of civic leaders, I think it was simply practical, especially when the Saints equaled and then exceeded the population of non-Latter-day Saint Kirtlanders sometime around 1834. The burden of running the township was exhausting with a massive influx of new arrivals. So having a Latter-day Saint district in the north created breathing room, and it allowed official township duties to be divided up between saints and non-saints. So this division of duties can be seen in Congregational or Presbyterian minister Truman Coe and Latter-day Saint leader Sidney Rigdon, both serving as elected school inspectors in April of 1836. So about the time the temple is dedicated, you have the Presbyterian / Congregational minister Truman Coe and Sidney Rigdon inspecting the local schools and showing the community is electing uh, both saints and non-saints. I've got lots of pictures here. I have a picture somewhere of Truman Coe and I couldn't find it. So here's his headstone, as well as the two churches at the bottom. When the saints were here in 1830s Kirtland, what is Old South today would have looked more like this log cabin. Today it's uh, the beautiful white church that you see there. And then before they were Old South, that sign that they have there at their building, they were South Kirtland Congregational Church. And of course, we have Brother Rigdon on the far side over there. So, in addition to my Latter-day Saint district hypothesis, it further seems that those saints who did get elected to office were often Kirtland residents before Joseph Smith Jr. arrived. So they were Kirtland residents who converted to the church, and importantly, they're respected bridge builders who were trusted to put their official responsibilities first over any conflicts with church allegiances. This would explain why Frederick G. Williams, for example, could win office, but Joseph Smith Jr. would lose election in his bid for county coroner in October of 1834, gaining only 2 votes in Kirtland itself, never mind the rest of the county. So Williams was willing to do what he felt was right as a township official, even when it cost him points with church leaders and membership. This was demonstrated in the fall of 1837 during tensions over the Kirtland Anti-Banking Safety Society. Joseph Smith Jr. accused a church member named Warren Parrish of embezzling funds from the bank, and he demanded that Williams, as Justice of the Peace, approve a warrant to search Parrish's trunk for the missing banknotes. Williams must have felt that doing so would have violated Parrish's rights because, as Lucy Mack Smith writes, the request was, quote unquote, flatly refused. Lucy Mack Smith continues, I insist upon a warrant, said Joseph, for if you will give me one, I can get the money, and if you do not, I will break you of your office. Well, break it is then, said Williams, and we will strike hands upon it. Very well, said Joseph, from henceforth I drop you from my quorum in the name of the Lord. So this break was especially pronounced when you consider that Smith had just named his son after Frederick G. Williams a few months before. The two men appear to have reconciled, but it didn't go unnoticed by members. And so a few months later, a church conference in November of 1837 fails to sustain Williams as a member of the First Presidency, with Hiram Smith being sustained in his place. All right. So Frederick G. Williams was involved with the church's political newspaper. Um, Interestingly, if we look at what is being advocated for in the paper, it's political positions that were very unpopular compared to what their neighbors were voting for. So the paper starts out being edited by Oliver Cowdery. Later, Williams becomes the editor. It supported a pro Martin Van Buren ticket. So it's pro Democrat, anti Whig paper. Peter Crowley writes that in February 1835, the first issue of the Northern Times appeared to a chorus of derisive welcomes from the local Whig newspapers. So the local Whig papers are not happy at all. Now, of course, Van Buren won the national election, but lost in Ohio with 47.6% of the vote. Importantly, he had even more support in Northeast Ohio. So Northeast Ohio is that top right-hand corner of Ohio, which clearly went for Harrison. So they're advocating for very differently than their neighbors on who should be the next president of the United States. Matching the positions of the Democratic Party at that time, the paper advocated against abolition. The stated reason in the editorial was to oppose whatever is calculated to disturb the peace and harmony of our Constitution and country. Now, to be fair, the Saints had just learned firsthand how volatile the topic of slavery could be when the church's press in Missouri promoted in July of 1833 the rights of free people of color. So, not even just slaves, but the rights of free people of color under state and federal law. And the paper then was subsequently destroyed by a mob. Ironically, both editorials included the phrase to prevent any misunderstanding. Um, Now, the Saints political newspaper in Kirtland promoting anti-abolition views, different from what the Evening and Morning Star promoted, or at least in tension with it, may have been a reason why, again, to look at Eber D. Howe, why he was so opposed to the Saints. So he was a well-known abolitionist. His paper, the Painesville Telegraph, supported abolition, and his house uh, was a spot on the Underground Railroad, known by the locals as Liberty Hollow, and to this day by some of the local racists as N-word Hollow. So he was a well-known advocate for ending slavery, for the worth of all persons, and you have the paper in Kirtland, the church's paper in Kirtland, promoting things that he certainly was not happy about, even if it was just trying to take a moderate position to avoid national discomfort. So another thing that the Saints did that upset him, he wanted to move, and a lot of people wanted to move the the county seat to Painesville, which is that top blue arrow. It was in Chardon, which was a more rural area, and it just made sense to move it to Painesville because it was not just the center of population and power in the county, but really throughout the Western Reserve. So the Saints originally in the paper supported moving it to Painesville, and then they flip-flopped um, and said, no, let's let it stay in Chardon. And this infuriated both Howe and as well as his brother, who then had taken over the editorialship of the paper. So the Saints are promoting things, that are upsetting, clearly upsetting their neighbors, and importantly, the power brokers within the county. All right. So here was the Painesville Telegraph, and laying out their displeasure, saying that the paper had its characteristic cupidity, its disgraceful course in advancing its interests. All right, my conclusion. On the 3rd of April 1837, elections moved back to the Red Schoolhouse in the Flats at the northern, or where the Latter-day Saints, the northern end of town, the Latter-day Saints, most of them were at. It's interesting, a statistically unlikely four-way tie occurred during the election. Four-way tie. Now, whether the tied votes were honest or not, it was indicative of extreme political competition in the township. To resolve the tied votes, lots were cast, and two Latter-day Saint candidates, Oliver Cowdery and Oliver Cowdery and Frederick G. Williams, lost out to non-Latter-day Saint non-Latter-day Saints. Importantly, a week later, they held another election, and this is when Cowdery and Williams go on to win as justices of the peace, which was a real win for the Saints. It didn't last long. Cowdery and Williams both resigned together in October of 1837 as the Saints were preparing to move to Missouri. Mormon Kirtland was nearing its end, and the two moderate Saints would face their own challenges with the church, leading to excommunication and then reinstatement. As the majority of the Saints left Kirtland in 1837 and into 1838, those left behind often suffered from poverty, Martin Harris included, leading township trustees to ask in 1838 if they should create an actual poorhouse to care for all of them. While this seems sincere, Oliver Cowdery moves back into town and almost immediately gets warned out in a clear attempt to disenfranchise him. Now, he'd broken from the church at this point. He'd returned from Missouri to Ohio to practice law, but perhaps even the threat of a former Latter-day Saint with any political influence was enough to raise suspicions among township officials who were just exhausted with the Latter-day Saints. Cowdery soon left Kirtland, moved to Tiffin, Ohio, where he was elected a township official. In 1839 and into the 1840s, as Joseph Smith Jr. settled in Nauvoo, Illinois, he seized upon opportunities to win local office, serving as a mayor and then Chief Justice of the Nauvoo Municipal Court. As several have observed, the Nauvoo Legion was the Saints' response to the mobs of Missouri to avoid being powerless again. And in like manner, I would argue that the Saints' political activity in Nauvoo, to include Joseph Smith Jr. running for President of the United States, can be understood as a response to the political disenfranchisement and legal opposition the Saints experienced in Kirtland and Geauga County, Ohio in the 1830s. Thank you.
And thank you. That was a fantastic presentation. Uh, Thank you especially for shedding some light into the political scene of 1830s Kirtland. This is a topic we don't often hear about, and I'm guessing it's new information for many of us tonight. So I do have a question for you. A couple of weeks ago, the Historic Sites Foundation Board of Directors was here in Kirtland, and in between some of those administrative sessions, we did take a little road trip down to Hiram, Ohio to see the John and Elsa Johnson farm. And it was a good reminder as we were touring that historic home what a significant role the Johnson family played, not only in Hiram, but also later when they relocated to Kirtland. So I have to ask, in your research, did you see anything about John Johnson or anyone from the Johnson family contributing to Kirtland politics or getting involved in Kirtland politics?
Yeah, absolutely. So, uh, John and Luke Johnson, so John's the father, both of them are the first Latter-day Saints that I can find that were elected to political office as Latter-day Saints. And that's the election of 1834. John Johnson was elected as a township trustee. So when he moved to Kirtland, he built an inn or a tavern. And what we find in the record is that the township trustees are meeting at the John Johnson Inn repeatedly. So he was able to make inroads and was one of those, I'm going to say, moderate Latter-day Saints who was a bridge builder between both communities, enough that the trustees are meeting there. They're holding town meetings in his inn. It's interesting that, like Frederick G. Williams, he actually goes through a period of disaffiliation with the church, frustrated over what happens with the bank. And there's some question whether or not he was fully left the church, or in any event, these moderates, because they're moderates, are trusted enough to be elected, but it also causes problems with the church and with the leadership of the church when they're not always willing to toe the line.
Interesting.
So, and
Thank you.
I should say Luke Johnson served as Justice of the Peace, same election.
Yeah. Oh. Any final words about 1830s politics, Truman Co., Kirtland era?
I think there's a lot more that still needs to be done on this topic. It's still a work in progress for me. Even as I was giving this, I was like, I need to go back and look at that, right? So uh, I am constantly going back to the source records to try to make sure that I've got this dialed in. Um, Eventually I hope to publish it, but I'm not there yet. But I appreciate having this conversation and all of the wonderful questions. And if anybody has any feedback, I'd love to receive it. I do think it's an important topic, and it's one that there isn't a whole lot out there on. So really happy and really blessed actually to be in Kirtland and be able to do this research and have access to the archives.
And we are grateful to you for sharing your knowledge and insight. Thank you so much. I learned a lot tonight, and I imagine many of you in the audience did as well. So thank you, Seth. Thank you, Wendy, for handling things behind the scenes for us, doing the job of you and Peter. Much, much appreciated. And of course, many thanks to all of you, our dear friends in the audience, for your love of a good story and for generously supporting the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation. Thank you so much for spending this Thursday evening with us. Now, I encourage all of you to tune in next week, next Thursday afternoon, November 20th, as we welcome Andrew Bolton to our autumn lecture series. As I mentioned, Andrew is the fourth speaker in our Your Story is Church History series. And next week, he's going to share his unique journey from English Catholic altar boy to Community of Christ apostle. So join us as we hear about his upbringing in England and how his father's experience as a soldier during World War II influenced and impacted Andrew's passion for Zion. So we hope you'll join us. Wendy, it looks like just dropped the link into the chat to register for next Thursday's lecture. And don't forget, next week's lecture starts at 1 p.m. Central, 2 p.m. Eastern. So friends, until then, keep reading your church history and have a great night.